Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel, Performances of Public Anthropology from Stand-Up Comedy to Critical Games. My name is Alexandros Papageorgiou. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Thessaly.
And I am Alexandra Siotou, a postdoctoral researcher at University of Thessaly.
And together with Professor Pηνελόπη Παπαηλία, we are working on the research project Anthrobombing Narrative Experimentation for the Design of a Public Anthropology Platform. Today, we're going to talk about performances of public anthropology, and we will attempt to explore how the use of alternative media can contribute to rethinking the discipline's epistemology and redefining the ways in which we conduct research, teach, and produce anthropological knowledge in general. The role of the public and our relation to it will also be at the core of our discussion. Joining us today are our distinguished panel participants. We'll start by welcoming you to this Distribute 2020 panel. Thank you all for being here. Let's make the necessary introductions now. Pηνελόπη Παπαηλία is an associate professor at the University of Thessaly, where she directs the Laboratory of Social Anthropology. She's also the director of the Pelion Summer Lab for Cultural Theory and Experimental Humanities and of the Data Stories Confestival. Eleana Yalouri is an associate professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences in Athens, where she is also the director of the Laboratory of Anthropological Research. Aris Anagnostopoulos is an honorary lecturer at the University of Kent in the UK. He has been the director and principal instructor of the Archaeological Ethnography Summer School in Gonies, Crete, since 2014. Today with us we have also Konstantinos Diamandis, visual and media anthropologist, who is helping us with the creation of the video. If everyone's ready, we can start our discussion. Our first question is for Pηνελόπη. How can experimental projects contribute to rethinking theoretical and methodological issues in anthropology and to redefining disciplinary epistemology?
Thanks so much for this wonderful invitation, Alexandros and Alexandra. Greetings to Distribute 2020. Kalispera Elada. In the past 5 years, I myself have been rethinking my role as a teacher, as a researcher, as an intellectual, and as a member of various communities. And as a result, I have reframed my work within an experimental humanities paradigm. So I'm basically not talking about just adding experimental methods to an ethnographic toolkit, but really reimagining theory and method in anthropology in a way that I think is appropriate to the contemporary historical, political, and technological moment. So just to give you an idea of what I mean by experiment, let's say you ask students in a course on the anthropology of death to apply the semester's case studies and theoretical tools to hosting a death cafe in an actual local cafe, prompting people, and this is always the key question, which people? To engage in discussions that bridge personal experience, local knowledge, and political debates about death. Or let's say you ask the participants in a summer lab on digital culture to create a game that has to do with social media or data surveillance. Again, inviting the local community to participate as players. So this is what I mean by an experiment for anthropology. So composing a game is really a different kind of writing than writing a paper. It's not about interpreting the world and representing it to one's peers, but about collaboratively designing an encounter with a public of non-experts a lot of the time as a gesture of conviviality and a means to create the circumstances for exchange and dialogue. So staging a public experiment in the way that I'm thinking about it breaks with traditional discursive modalities in anthropology, such as documenting or making an argument. An experiment is performative. It's not explanatory. It's speculative, so it's oriented to the future. It's not about what happened in the past, so in a way it's not exactly ethnography as we have known it, or it's another kind of ethnography.
Okay, thanks, Pηνελόπη. The next question is for anthrobombing, and my colleague Alexandra will answer it. In the debate around public anthropology, many discussants point out the risk of simplifying anthropological knowledge. Shepard Hughes mentions that, quote, scholars who want to reach diverse publics are often penalized for dumbing down anthropological thinking, vulgarizing anthropology, and sacrificing academic standards, end of quote. Based on your experience, do you believe that we can convey complicated anthropological concepts without compromising either our ideas and politics or the genre that we employ? And if so, then how? How do we decide which lines to draw and where to draw them?
Thank you for the question. Actually, this was one of the challenges we faced when we decided to use stand-up comedy as an alternative medium to disseminate anthropological knowledge outside the academy. I mean, really, how could we actually convey complicated anthropological concepts through writing a performing a humorous set addressed to a public unfamiliar with anthropological knowledge? Moreover, in our case, we felt that there was also the risk of not only of vulgarizing, but also of mocking anthropology. We should realize that our concerns reflect the dominant assumptions regarding scientific discourses in Western societies and how science is linked to text and reason. However, stand-up comedy shares similarities with anthropology. It is based on observation of a comedian's culture and brings into light and on stage normative behaviors and sensitive socio-political topics, inviting the audience to reflect on the ways in which they interact with the world. From that perspective, stand-up comedy seemed to us like an appropriate form for an anthropologist to attempt a critical approach and analysis of everyday life. So, the question was if we could or should adjust to the stand-up comedy format, meaning if we should adopt the genre structure. After all, we would be addressing a stand-up comedy public. But to what extent should we compromise? Where to draw the line? In the end, we were not willing to be funny at any cost. That's why we were very cautious so that we wouldn't unwittingly produce representations of class, gender, ethnic identities that would reinforce dominant discourses about gender, sexuality, ethnicity. Besides that, we wanted to provoke laughter, but we were also intending to introduce anthropological knowledge to the audience's critical attention, which can easily not be funny at all. Quite the contrary. It is the absence of laughter, even a momentary frustration, that could lead to self-reflection. Concluding, I think we just try to respect two sets of cultural practices and their regulatory frameworks, accepting the fact that it may not be possible to convey the density and full complexity of an ethnographic text through stand-up comedy. But we could also ask ourselves, is written language and specialized terminology what makes the comprehension of the world deeper and richer? Couldn't stand-up comedy, a performative expression of thoughts and ideas, contribute to an audience's better understanding of social reality, making the familiar unfamiliar and vice versa? Why we should always perceive public anthropology as opposite and inferior to academic anthropology and not complementary?
Okay, Alexandra, thank you.
Thank you.
Now the interviewee becomes the interviewer.
Yes, and the next question is for Eliana. Eliana, what kinds of data do you think are co-produced and become accessible through experimental methods and new collaborations?
I think we do not need to predefine the kinds of data experimental methods will yield. What is at the core of the notion of the experimental itself is the fact that it does not conform to conventional forms. Also, what is at the core of collaborations is that they take place between partners, fields, disciplines, and so on. Paul Stoller has tellingly termed anthropology sojourners of the between, that is, those who always find themselves between here and there, amidst different languages, different cultures and perceptions of reality. So I believe it is important that we maintain and encourage this in-between liminal space, a space shaped within different fields of theory and practice, a space in between teaching and research, research and publication, and so on. And I also think that it is this indeterminate and dynamic space that could act as a field of experimentation with new tools, theories, and techniques, and as a framework for testing not only the epistemological, but also the ideological and the ethical limits of such experimentations.
Thank you. So the next question is for Penelope. Hassan argues, if something of the ethnography is certainly lost in translation, something else is gained in the encounter with new publics. According to your experience, what do you think anthropology gains through this experimentation?
Picking up of what Ilana just said, I'd say one thing that anthropology gains from the paradigm of the experiment is that the borders between research and dissemination are fundamentally blurred because of the feedback loop from the involved publics. It's important to underline that experiments are not projects, which is a beloved word of research grants. They're not about projecting, about sending out into the world finished ideas, but about testing contemporary realities by setting up situations that keep people talking, moving, doing, in turn generating new questions, which feed into new research. In my experience, the level of excitement of participants involved designing and staging these experiments has been remarkable, and is also a really important thing that's gained. A key part of the experiment is its replicability, which takes the possibility of experiment going way beyond the chronotope of the class, of the semester, of the summer lab. And the dynamic of each iteration seems to drive the designers to hone and think and rethink their experiments, replaying them and each time reading more, writing more, and thinking more. From an anthropological standpoint, I also think what was really critical about the productions that I've been involved in is that they're never independent of the idea of the public, since they're based on the engagement with them. They couldn't take place without them. So the question that we had, for instance, in the village when we were doing the summer lab, and we talked a lot about with the cohort, was, well, as newcomers to this village and very short time dwellers, do we have a right to create this experiment? Will local people come to it? But at the same time, these concerns couldn't be so easily swept away by saying, oh, well, let's just not do it. Because that also means spending 10 days talking among ourselves about digital culture and power relations in this case, without communicating what we are doing. What would be the ethics and politics of that choice? So to me, these are critical questions for an engaged anthropology.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Aris and Eliana. First, we'll ask you both, and first Aris can respond, and afterwards Eliana. So the question is, in your experimental project, well, we can call it a project, in your experiment, which was the public that you were addressing? How did the need to approach a public affect your decisions regarding the choice of medium or media and content? And how was your relation with the public shaped through this experimentation? Ari?
Okay, I will go first. Well, thanks very much, first of all, for inviting me. It's been very fruitful up to now. I've filled a couple of pages of notes already. And in archaeology, there's already been a very well-developed public debate about how archaeology itself can address different publics, different groups, even different people in what it does. So the project that I'm going to talk about was part of an archaeological research project, which is still called the Three Peak Sanctuaries of Central Crete. It takes place in a very small village in Crete. The village is primarily inhabited by elderly people. And the goal of this project was to actually involve more people actively in making decisions about the research, the preservation, and the management of their own heritage. So from the beginning, it was, let's call it a public project. Its goal was to actually engage people. So the public that we were addressing was mainly the inhabitants of the village. But we were very careful not to ascribe any notion of community, since even this very small place was a very mobile population, many people coming and going, but also it has a lot of divisions within the village inhabitants. One of the main divisions we had to address was the division along gender lines. So that regulates actual existence in public, appearance in public. So women in the village do not often appear in public unless they have a very good reason to do so. And although our team is mostly female researchers, we could only find those women in their houses. So we could only talk to them individually or in small groups. So our project, the project that we wanted to set up, was a project that would give them a reason to be somewhere, would give women in the village a reason to be outside their house, somewhere in the village, where they would talk to us and between each other, to each other. So what we did was we invited an artist, Alexia Caravella, a female artist, to set up an open studio curated by the curator and anthropologist Katerina Constantinou. We were given a space in the school, in the now disused school of the village, by the Cultural Association of the village. And Alexia set up a workshop of weaving. So we had 2 looms for weaving donated by the women of the 2 women in the village. So it was, what we set up was an artistic studio, basically. Alexia sat there and started learning how to weave by the women of the village. Gradually, this actually became a space that not only women, but also a lot of men showed up. So it was, I think it was an experiment that actually showed us how these things can actually supersede your expectations in a way, or planning. But what I am thinking more as an experiment on how we convey what we are doing to the people. So I agree there's part of this, as Pηνελόπη said, that is open and stochastic, and it's basically a performance, a stage performance, an event, I would call it, that goes its own way. We don't actually control anything, we don't. But we felt that there was also another aspect of doing something in public, which was to try to explain to people what just happened, or try to explain to people what is happening there, because people are asking what is happening. So instead of actually trying to say this in a theoretical way, or try to describe it in plain words, what we did instead was we devised a song to do that. So we took a melody that is very common in the village. It's actually specific to the village. You can't find it anywhere else. And we wrote a song on it in the local dialect, describing the whole project. In the end, in an event, the tune was immediately picked up by the younger people in the village. They gave it a name, and every time we meet, they ask us to sing it to them. So it actually it became, you know, part of, let's say, the rituals of the village. But we did this. It was an idea. We didn't just come up with this. We were actually engaged in a lot of, let's say, a continuous contest of expressing things in a poetic way. So a lot of people in the village actually write songs, write madinades, write small distichs, and a lot of people have written songs about us. So we thought we would also write another for that described our own project in plain words to these people. So okay, we never became the chief poets of the village, but I think we actually, by doing this, our relation with the public was transformed, because we started talking in, let's say their own language. We did something they do. So okay, I think that pretty much sums up the answer to this question.
Okay. Eliana?
Okay, so I have been engaged in different multidisciplinary experimental projects, and I have therefore addressed different kinds of publics, mostly academic multidisciplinary publics, which makes my case different than that of Aris or probably yours. Now, the thing about any interdisciplinary venture is that it may ignite long-term ethical and epistemological concerns within the realms of each one of the disciplines involved, and may heighten rather than neutralize disciplinary boundaries. And that was, for example, the case the first time I presented the video, The Metaphysics of the Greek Crisis, at a conference about the Greek crisis in Athens. I was initially invited to present an article in that conference, but I preferred to seek for a different language, experientially closer to my own experiences of the crisis and able to convey its effective, often uncanny, invisible, yet immanent presence. So I invited a visual artist, Nina Papa, to collaborate with me on this project. And the video we produced consists of a collage of YouTube videos extracts on the theme of prophecy, and specifically predictions about what is yet to come in Greece. These prophecies were sourced from TV programs, the news, personal recordings, and present well-known or anonymous people, Greek and British politicians, economists, Greek and American priests, as well as clairvoyants and chartists predicting the Greek future. Now, a critique leveled at our video by an anthropologist at the conference had to do with how our treatment of the material and the content of the video made the viewers laugh, which brings us back to your discussion of anthropology versus stand-up comedy and seriousness versus funny. That anthropologist pointed out the risk of ambiguity in the selection and juxtaposition of the specific sociocultural categories included in the montage, namely the priest, the economist, the nun, the politician, the astrologer, all making predictions. And he thought that this might lead to possible ridiculing of the social categories involved. Of course, what the anthropologist did not consider was that the audience may have laughed out of different reasons: embarrassment, awkwardness, empathy, mockery, and so on. If the anthropologist considered ambiguity as a negative and risky quality of our video, it is ambiguity that Nina and I found appropriate, partly because we felt that ambiguity was part and parcel of the way we and others experience the crisis itself. So what I find of interest here is that ambiguity, and maybe something to think about, is that ambiguity, a quality considered valuable in art practices, was considered non-compliant with the ideal of the objective and transparent analysis of the social sciences.
The next question is, For Aris, once again, and Alexandros. Was the public's response in agreement with your expectations? Which criteria do you use to assess whether the public's involvement, engagement, was successful or not? Aris?
That's a very good question that we have been thinking a lot while in the field, but also afterwards. And I think the stress of the questions falls more on the expectations rather than the public's response. So what do we actually expect the public to do when we show them our incredible project? We have this notion in our head that an event is something that needs to be organized as we expect it to happen, that happens on time, that everybody arrives when we expect them to arrive and in the mood that we expect them to arrive. And this was something that taught us a lot about how to actually evaluate, as you say, engagement in any project, actually. So I think if we want to measure, apart from or despite the usual ways of measuring impact, etc., which are now in place, we should take a very different and much more audience-based approach to what is considered audience response. So, for example, it's very difficult to gauge impact from very early responses, because sometimes even negative feedback is more impactful than everybody shaking your hand and saying, wow, what a great project. So it leads to deeper changes and vice versa. Something that is super at the beginning may leave no trace afterwards. I think that actually even the idea of evaluating or measuring feedback is tied to a quantification of social research outputs in the neoliberal university, but it's also tied to the way large organizations sponsor social research and engagement projects in our case. So there is one thing I feel that is not measured and perhaps cannot be measured in such evaluations, and this is the public itself. So its needs and its capacities. I feel that the public has become a sort of a cumulative capital in the attention economy. It's either 1 or 0, interested or not. But I find, from my experience, and a lot of people are discussing this in archaeology, that there are gradations to engagement. There isn't just we like it or not. There's a continuum, as people say, but also there are stances, behaviors, maybe hesitations, or even outright refusals to engage with a project. And these things are perhaps never visible at all to measurements. And besides all these factors, what I feel is also equally important and is completely left out is, I would call it the existential transformation that may happen through such projects. So we all know that there's a very strong affective element in any ethnographic project, which is never included in, thank God, in bureaucratic exercises at measuring impact, and perhaps cannot be measured at all. I'm not talking about satisfaction levels or impact on a society. I'm talking about feelings that at a first glance may not be relevant to a project, but they may very well be. So, for example, in our case, our presence in the field, our experimental methods, our being there, actually became an element of life in the village, and an element that supported the well-being and happiness of elderly locals. So we were not only researchers, but also supporters, friends, care workers. Sometimes I would say once too often we're entertainers to these people as well. So our presence and our activity in the field actually prompted them to revisit their past in ways that were meaningful for them. And even now, when we're not there, we get phone calls saying, "When are you coming back?" So if you ask how we judge our projects in the field, that's a very different background from how we evaluate them in different contexts, like universities or reviews. So it's a very reciprocal thing, and it has to do with the quality of relationships that develop in the field. So I'd have to say it's an ethical stance. It's a feeling that you did something right, rather than, you know, an evaluation of impact in the field.
Thank you. Alexandra?
Okay, so in our case, in our experimentation, our goal was to perform anthropological knowledge using humor, mainly the genre of stand-up comedy. We decided we would not talk explicitly about a specific concept, body of knowledge, or ethnography, but instead comment on social phenomena through an anthropological lens.
Ας πούμε, αν και για το Αμαζόνιος ή η Αυστραλία. Είναι ο πλανήτης μας αφορά όλους. Με νοιάζει αν πλημμυρίζει το Μπαγκλαντές. Έχω παραγγείλει τα καινούργια Nike. Τουλάχιστον τα πήρα διάβροχα.
In the beginning, our concern was whether our piece would be anthropological enough. But we also realized that we needed to adapt to the genre that was new to us, since in stand-up comedy, laughter is the basic requirement for acceptance. So we were aiming at creating a performance that would be funny enough in order to make space for some, let's say, serious ideas to be expressed. Basically, the conventions of the genre, which is achieving laughter through jokes, would facilitate and set the stage for performing social and cultural critique, in a way. In the piece I prepared, I wanted to close with some thoughts that were not funny, and it was not my intention to make them funny.
Αλλά θα προτιμούσα 1000 φορές να μεγαλώσω σε queer, lesbian, gay κατάληψη στη Μακεδονία, ακόμα και την Νότια, παρά στο σπίτι του Γιάννη που βγάζει τώρα. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
And it was a strategic choice to put them in the end in order to have gained the acceptance of the audience beforehand through laughter. Through those final statements, I took a clear political position toward Greek nationalism, the refugee crisis, homelessness, homophobia, and discrimination. But just before the end, while I was still talking about these things, I made a final joke, just to lighten the atmosphere and thus respecting the genre's conventions. All this said, and despite this strategic planning of the piece, there was no foolproof way of knowing how the audience received it, since the clapping at the end could be related to any part of the performance. Like, this is related to what both Eleana and Ari said about the ambiguity of the reactions. Even laughter, you cannot know exactly why people laughed. So the setting and the public that we imagined we were addressing definitely influenced our choices, but we cannot be sure how the serious part, let's say, was actually received. So we guess this is also a matter of experience through our participation in the milieu. The more you get to know a certain milieu, the more you can read people's reactions and get feedback. And this is the reason why we'll be back on stage this Saturday. Finally, I think it's worth highlighting how the context affects choices, even on a heretic platform like stand-up comedy, where performance can supposedly be critical and even ironic of practically any issue. For example, the final joke was about the issue of Macedonia, around which there is quite a polemic in Greece. The open mic night I performed at was in Athens. I would think twice before making this joke in northern Greece. It can be fruitful, of course, to have negative reactions sometimes, but it can also be dangerous. Yes, that's our answer. The next question, now I'm picking it up, is for Pηνελόπη. And it is, like this. When using funny and fashionable experimental methods, is there a risk of participating as actors in creative industries, normalizing the use of these cultural technologies and reinforcing neoliberal ways of being, thinking, and learning?
Thank you for that question, Alexandros. It's something that's actually been very much on my mind, especially after this year's Pelion Summer Lab, in which we had decided to have as our experiment after the 10-day program, intensive seminars that had to do this year with data and power. With the experiment that the cohort created was a game. Even though during our 10 days of seminars, we had very intense theoretical conversations about platform capitalism and specifically critiqued gamification as a mechanism of platform capitalism, kind of, making everything into a fun game in which we're going to level up and get awards. And this is something that we see on, the platforms from, Airbnb to, other realms we don't associate with games. And the serious game industry itself is very central to a neoliberal mode of infotainment. So if we were going to make a game, would we be lumped in with these practices? And in relation to what we've heard of the other projects that people have done, certainly making a game seems like a much more entertaining activity than to have a series of lectures on platform capitalism and data valence. It would be something that would make us more appealing. And here I'd like to talk about the idea of the spectacle, which is a key part of the experiment, which might seem to be what's problematic about it, this idea of staging a public event as a spectacle, and defend it in a way. So, in the current social media moment, thinking in process on a stage is, whether we like it or not, an imperative. We can't hole away working alone anymore in a library for a decade before producing a polished ethnography. The idea of the publicity and publication are morphing in network culture. So this acting, and this seemed very clear from what Aris was saying, acting on a public stage has a lot of risks. You can fail, he suggested that. And also Liana and Alexandros, in terms of the ambiguity of these reactions. So, and also we don't know until we do it how it's going to turn out. We can't predict the public's role in it, which is different, I think, than just presenting a paper, which also could not go that well, but we can kind of gauge what's going to happen. We're not so dependent on the public to actually make the thing work. So in my opinion, doing public events is not a trendy way of showing off and selling what we do. It's actually about going out on a limb and being able to think on one's feet, to react, to listen, to share and distribute authorship, and to be prepared to fail. Another thing I think that's important, and also different from just sort of creating events that are more palatable than our usual academic discourse, is that this spectacularization adds an element of affect and adrenaline, pleasure, anticipation of the unexpected. We're waiting for Alexandros's joke. We want to be there. But this isn't really a gimmick, unless we think and consider that the intellectual is defined in opposition to those kinds of energies. And I categorically do not believe that. And this is something that we discussed in relation to the game. So this year's Pelion Summer Lab, the game was first played in a village in a mountain in Greece. Then it was actually the participants staged the game at a conference. It was on Serious Games. So in a way, the games that they presented were presented in this more neoliberal context of serious games, and in fact, the fact that they presented games that had no ends, for instance, no winners, was something that actually in that context was very radical. And then actually had the opportunity to present the games at an art gallery in a very kind of avant-garde space of the School of Fine Arts. And so then we discussed in that event was, again, the issue that keeps coming up again and again in this roundtable is, does playing a game have to be fun? And and so maybe it's really more about something that can actually be playing the game can be difficult, but it can still be engaging. And the last point I'd like to make, and also came up already with Ileana's and Ari's comments, is that there's the centrality of scenography to the experiment. So making experiment, since it's a performative, aesthetic, and a sensory process, so it organically is coming into contact with contemporary art. I think that that's a constructive provocation for anthropology to activate the creative potential in anthropology, and that's not just making a creative industry. So that's something that's really central to unleash, I believe.
Thank you. And the last question. It is for Eliana. I'm sorry. So, Eliana, what do you think learning through experimental methods can provide to students and young researchers?
Okay, thank you for that question. First of all, it helps students and young researchers, but also us, realize that, because sometimes we tend to forget it, that knowledge is not a finalized and predetermined product, an article, a book, an ethnographic film, a photo essay, and so on. But it is part of a long process involving various changing parameters and interconnecting teaching and research, theory and practice. Secondly, it helps think that different topics and areas of interest may require different methodological tools and different forms of research. Aesthetics and matters of form may constitute an object of anthropological study, but they do not usually seem to particularly concern anthropologists as research tools. Still, I find them crucial in the research process. Thirdly, it helps them realize that research needs not to be lonely. And I will go back to what Pηνελόπη was saying earlier, that anthropological research evolves in an increasingly networked universe, and anthropologists are not the only producers of knowledge. I believe in the creation of possibilities for more cooperative research models, which will transcend the dominant image of the lone researcher, which in any case, as far as anthropology is concerned, is a construct of the early 20th century. Last but not least, I think that it helps them realize that research can be fun. Again, going back to a similar point made by Pηνελόπη. So it can be fun, it can be unpredictable and adventurous, but also it may allow for the reimagining of anthropology and may create a breeding ground for it to act once more as a form of cultural criticism in the contemporary world.
Okay, thank you so much. These have been our questions. You could all join us, please. And so we would like to hear from you now before we close. If you have some final comments, ideas you want to share based on our discussion, please make it brief. Eliana.
I quite liked the concept of serious games mentioned by Pηνελόπη, and it just, strikes me that games and laughing are serious matters. That's all.
One thing I would like to say is this panel itself is a very experimental experience for me, and been very, it's not like we have that many opportunities to talk about these issues together, and it's amazing how many overlaps I find in our discussion today.
Okay. Any other comments? No. Eleana.
Maybe one just last thought that in the end, it's all about why, what, and for whom we are doing what we do. This reminds me of another discussion we had a few months ago when you presented your work on performance stand-up comedy. And the question arose as to, are you doing it for anthropology? Are you doing it for the public? Are you doing it for epistemological reasons? Are you doing it for political reasons? And so on and so forth. So I think this is an extra topic to consider.
Of course. Konstantine?
Now can we do the after film now? The after
Now you can put on your black jacket.
Κωνσταντίνε, κάνουμε stop recording.